Hello, and thank you, Richard. It is a great honor for me to be moderating this discussion about open and ethical artificial intelligence. We are going to have some interesting panelists who are going to talk about this evolving topic. We are going to start the discussion with a discussion from Pierre, the co-founder of the Ethical Data Group. Then we are going to have an English language panel to deepen the discussion with three eminent guests. At the end of the panel, we are going to have a question and answer period with all the participants, and you can ask your questions in the chat. And now, here's Pierre. This person has been a leader in the expertise for artificial intelligence and has worked on some projects in Quebec. This person is also an expert in ethics and has applied their knowledge in mobile data, healthcare, and social media. This person is very involved in research and works at the Laval University's Institute for Artificial Intelligence. I'm very proud to welcome you today, and you have the floor. Hello, everyone. I am going to try to share my screen. Okay, so now I can see my PowerPoint. My presentation is about the importance of having open data and research in artificial intelligence. I am also particularly interested in the ethical considerations in research in artificial intelligence. Recently, we've seen that artificial intelligence is being used in multiple areas, whether it's biology, biosciences, chemistry, etc. Oftentimes, in these sectors, there's an expectation that the experiments that are made are reproducible. But an article was recently published in 2020 by Joëlle Pineau, a researcher at McGill, and she showed that it's not always possible to repeat and reproduce these projects. So most researchers have a hard time with reproducibility for multiple reasons. Sometimes it's because of the protocol, and sometimes it's because of the data set itself. So 50% of researchers are unable to reproduce their own research. That's a really big number, knowing that we need that research to consolidate the validity of that research and to make science move forward. That's why a year ago, the Nobel laureate that you can see here on the screen, Ms. Arnold, she had to retract one of her own articles because it was not reproducible. So that's a very important matter. And at the same time, in order to make data open, we are facing some significant challenges, and these challenges touch on privacy. When we talk about privacy, we're talking about the right to keep our information private. It means that people have a right to confidentiality, to a private life, to anonymity. So that's what it means when we talk about privacy. And there's also the matter of anonymization. For example, when we make data open, the data should not help to re-identify people. Therefore, we need to use anonymization techniques, and they need to be as recent and as up-to-date as possible, because otherwise we could end up identifying people. The last thing that is important is aggregated data. It means that Open data sets need to help research to need to help advance research. So in the United States, in Ohio, there's a lawyer who used a data set that helped to figure out that that data set, well, it showed that African Americans did not have access to drinking water. So that lawyer was able to use that data set to win a case against a city. So that shows the importance of disaggregated data because that disaggregated data can give us a wealth of information. And that information would not have been discernible if the information was still heavily aggregated. Therefore, open data is very important. In Quebec, we have some projects that are ongoing. You've probably seen the presentation from Professor Rush. That professor works on geolocalized data. We also heard about some projects that were done. If you look at Data Quebec, you will see all the applications that were designed because data was open. For example, there were applications made for emergency rooms in hospitals and applications made for public transit. So these data sets were usable, and we have proof. Here's an interesting project that we have in Quebec that's not related to open data, but that's related to public data. There's a data set that is accessible to the public, and that was made public by Leader Tech, and it's called ICSET. And that data set gives access to 28,000 annotated images. So for people who are trying to develop autonomous driving vehicles, that information is useful for them. So that's public data, but not necessarily open data. Now let's talk about the group of experts on ethics for open data. We are a group that works on these specific questions. I'm having a bit of a technical issue. So we work on these specific questions. We are trying to do some research on artificial intelligence while maintaining privacy and while using blockchain. We are trying to create ethical best practices in order to avoid issues with digital trust. We don't want these issues to emerge, and we don't want these risks to become an issue for vulnerable populations, for example. We don't want some population subgroups to start distrusting us. This interest for open data is very fundamental, and it makes research more accessible for researchers from across the world. It also means that results are going to be reproducible by other people and that the research can keep progressing. Thank you. I think that your presentation helped us to better appreciate the opportunities that this can bring us.
So that we can continue the conversation with three esteemed panelists. And during this panel, I hope that we can dive deeper into the relationship between AI and open data and really draw some conclusions around how open data can support more transparent, responsible applications of AI, which have positive impacts on our everyday lives. I also want to think about what AI can learn from the open data community, a movement that was founded on a set of principles, of course, around transparency, openness, and accountability. So without further ado, who's going to be joining me in this discussion today? So first, I have the honor of presenting Naysan Saran, the co-founder and CEO of Can Forecast. It's a company that helps cities to transition towards a proactive approach to water management. Prior to founding Can, Naysan worked as a scientific programmer at Environment Canada, where she participated in the development and deployment of a machine learning-based approach for post-processing of numerical weather forecasts. We also have the pleasure of having Eleonore Fournier-Tombs with us. Eleonore is a data scientist and an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law and the coordinator of the research share on accountable AI in a global context. She lectures in technology at McGill University and Université de Montréal and consults at the World Bank. Her academic work is focused on automated methods for the measurement of political deliberation, as well as the impacts of emerging technologies on vulnerable populations. And last but not least, it's a great honor to have with us Abhishek Gupta, the founder and principal researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, an international nonprofit research institute with a mission to democratize AI ethics literacy. He also works as a machine learning engineer at Microsoft and is CSE responsible AI board member at Microsoft. His work focuses on applied technical and policy measures for building ethical, safe, and inclusive AI systems. So let's get the ball rolling. I want to start things off by giving each of you a couple minutes to reintroduce yourselves and, focus on how AI and open data fits into your work. So let's start with Naysan. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here today. So my name is Naysan. I'm the co-founder of a company called Can Forecast. We're lucky enough to be working with approximately 20 municipalities now across Canada, and we actually started as the 2016 winner of the aqua hacking competition. And the aqua hacking competition, for those who don't know, is an open data-based competition that groups a lot of people from different backgrounds around Canada to create the most interesting solutions around water conservation. So we started like this with actually an open data set from the city of Montreal of the water quality at the St. Lawrence River. And we're able to create a machine learning algorithm that was predicting the water quality ahead of time. And by the end of the competition, so that was a 6-month hackathon, we actually had a product that was performing better for public health than what the city was using. And that's how the city of Montreal gave us our first contract. Long story short, now we're in 17, close to 18 cities. So it's really, we became something out of nothing because of open data and AI. So very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Naysan. And it's great to really see how your work has evolved over the years. It's truly wonderful. Let's go to Eleonore, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's really a pleasure to be here and to speak with all of you. As Miranda mentioned, I do a lot of research in a variety of contexts, particularly leading a research lab at the University of Ottawa, which is interesting because as a data scientist, I'm actually working at the Faculty of Law. So really thinking about the societal impacts of technologies, particularly for decision making, and also kind of the evolving world of AI policy, which is really interesting. And one of the reasons that I'm really excited to be here today is because I've been interested in open data for over a decade. And I really feel that, at the time in 2008, 2009, 2010, different governments around the world started publishing public data sets to move towards transparency and accountability. So for me, this was really a precursor to the work that we're doing, we're all, interested in now. At the time, there was a lot of energy around making data available, accessible technically via API, and how to dialogue with journalists or researchers who wanted to analyze it. And that's continuing today. But now, we're seeing that this is part of a movement to think about technology in relation to democracy and citizen participation. And so many algorithms in AI are developed on open data. So an example of that is BERT, which is currently the largest NLP, natural language processing model. And it was trained on Wikipedia and Google Books, which are really important sources of open data. And I think we've realized that in a lot of cases, AI models need to be open themselves, both in terms of open source, but they also need to be explainable and accountable. And so there's a lot, just like when the open data movement started, there's a lot of energy globally to find ways through ethics, certifications, and even policy to protect the positive effects of AI on society and mitigate their risks. So that's what I'm working on right now, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this with fellow panelists.
Wonderful, thank you. I heard I'm having a bit of problems with my microphone, so I hope this fixes things. Sometimes you can hear me a bit clearer. Yes, I get a thumbs up. Thank you, Abhishek. And going straight to you, Abhishek, if you can please introduce yourself and talk to us about the Montreal AI Ethics Institute.
Yeah, well, first off, glad to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Um, it's so my journey in AI ethics started about 4.5 years ago now. I was attending the AI for Good Global Summit, the inaugural summit that happened at the United Nations, and this was 1 year prior to the official enactment of the GDPR in Europe, and what I realized there was that the Europeans were quite mature in their discussions around data privacy and how that extended to automated decision making. And coming back to Canada, I realized that we were lagging behind a little bit in terms of these conversations, and I sort of, I guess, took it upon myself to kickstart that movement a little bit in Montreal, and sort of consolidating the efforts that were taking place in sort of silos and pockets around Canada, and helping to drive those conversations forward. As Miranda already mentioned, the Montreal AI Ethics Institute started with a vision to democratize AI ethics literacy, really lower the barriers for people to participate. The core belief that we have at the Institute is that anybody and everybody really has the ability to contribute to these discussions and should contribute to these discussions on both the technical and policy measures as it relates to the ethical, safe, and inclusive development of AI. What that means really is we make this knowledge for meaningful participation more accessible. Part of that comes from, as other panelists and the presentation alluded to, comes from open data, comes from explainability, comes from making these ideas transparent and accessible. But also it comes from upskilling people to a point where they're able to make nuanced comments and participate meaningfully in these discussions. My work specifically focuses on organizational and technical challenges as they relate to operationalizing responsible AI in practice, because that's been something that's been a big hurdle for organizations, both big and small, and that's a core part of my work, especially as we talk about open data and how that plays into reporting standards. As an example, the kind of reports that you're able to file, the kind of audits that you're able to support as a part of that will be essential in driving compliance as it relates to responsible AI. But happy to dive into all this and more as we get deeper into the panel. So excited to be here. Looking forward to this.
Great. We're super excited to have you. So thank you, Abhishek. And I must say, actually, your work around democratizing AI ethics literacy really inspired me to take part in this conversation and, in fact, moderate it. And, I'm not an expert in AI. Actually, my background is more in open data and actually urban planning. But just, some of the work that you've done, just saying, hey, you can join the conversation. You don't need a background in machine learning to be part of this discussion. So I just want to thank you all for being here, and thank you, Abhishek, for inspiring me to join you today. So I just, again, in this notion of let's democratize things here, I just want to put some essential notions on the table to make sure that everyone's comfortable with the terms that we're going to be using today. So artificial intelligence, it's a big word. We've already mentioned it a few times. I was hoping maybe, Eleonore, you could kind of give me a definition of AI just in some as simple as you can put it, so that we can have everyone understand what we're talking about today. So what's your take on AI? How would you define it?
Sure. So I kind of look back, thinking about this a bit, I looked back to some of the definitions that were put together by the OECD and the European Commission. I really like them because they're broad. And I guess this preamble says, as well, that there can be different ways of looking at artificial intelligence. It's a really big field. But the definition that I like to go with is a machine-based system that for a given set of human-defined objectives makes predictions, recommendations, or decisions. And so I think that kind of encompasses sort of the objectives and the uses of artificial intelligence without going too deep into what that machine-based system can be. And I'm sure that, the other speakers will have more technical definitions, but I feel like from a kind of a broad perspective. It's, thinking about it as, a computational system that allows us, we have input data and it allows us to make decisions, make predictions, and that influence our society. That's kind of the way in which I would see AI.
That's great. Thank you, Eleonore. Another kind of essential notion, of course, that we're going to be using in this discussion is open data. So open data, of course, is data that can be freely used by anyone. It's available. People can republish it as they wish without restrictions and in a machine-readable format. And, in the context of this discussion, my take is I see open data as a channel through which information is opened, it's challenged in the public sphere. And, as I already mentioned, the notions of transparency, openness, and accountability are really some of the pillars of open data. And we're also seeing these principles finding their way into AI discourse, particularly as AI systems and its outputs and impacts raise a host of ethical questions around consent, bias, discrimination, fairness, etc. I also wanted to take a moment to remember that AI is not transparent or open by default. So in fact, due to the nature of AI itself, it's difficult even for the humans that design the systems themselves to understand how the system derived its output. And with that being said as well, it's interesting to remember that while AI is often built on proprietary data, Eleonore already mentioned a couple of examples about how AI can draw on open data to train its models and to actually operate. Now, open data can come in all sorts of forms. It can be small data. It can be just a CSV file with 10 entries in it, or it can be big data. It can be a database that has thousands and thousands of entries in it. So my question for you, Naysan, is how does both small data and big data impact your work? And how does each come into play in the algorithm that your team uses to predict water quality?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. So for us, we actually have two solutions right now that we have developed for municipalities. One of them is IntelliSwim. So it's the one that predicts water quality. And for this, usually we don't have a lot of data, except if we're working with a large enough municipality like Montreal and Toronto, then they do have years and years of samplings of people going to the beach, actually taking a sample of water, sending it to the lab, and they compile everything. And both actually cities publish some of their E. coli values online. But it's usually when we work with smaller municipalities in Canada, they usually have smaller data sets, and the way we deal with them is that we use different algorithms. So just to give you an example, as you mentioned, if you have like what's traditionally called AI now, so it's going to be an artificial neural network, a convolutional network. So it's going to be a huge black box that's pretty complex. And because it has a lot of skews and things that can actually be fit into the data set, you need a lot of data to make sure that this black box is not going to overfit. So it's not going to learn by heart your data, because if it does, then it's going to be worse when it comes to predicting. So what we do when we have small data sets, we tend to simplify our models a lot. So we use statistical models, so Bayesian statistics. There is a whole bunch of statistical models that you can actually use for smaller data sets that actually are easier to interpret as well. So usually what we tell the city is that, okay, you don't have a lot of data, so what we're going to do is we're going to start working a simpler model. It's probably not going to perform so well the first year, but it's going to learn. Because it's simpler, it's easier to understand for you. But as you start to accumulate more data, and we're going to tell you when to sample, for instance, as you start to accumulate more data, the model is going to be better, and we're going to have the capacity to make it more complex next year. So that's really how we deal with small data sets. We have another solution that's called IntelliPipes. So it's basically taking the whole water network of your municipality and making predictions of where you should replace the pipes before they fail. This usually the cities have a lot of data, and we ask them to have at least 5 years of data. What we managed to do for this one, because pipes in North America, they kind of have the same standards from city to city, and especially in Canada, especially in the Eastern Canada, you have the same temperatures, you have the same weather patterns. So what we do is we basically work we call it a community of municipal innovators. So right now it's 12 different municipalities that have actually accepted to aggregate their data sets. So let's say one city doesn't have enough of this particular type of water mains, then we're going to select automatically within our data set something that looks similar. We don't tell them which city, but they get the chance to aggregate that. So that's how we manage to really balance between small data sets, simpler models, big data sets, more complicated models, and you always have the capacity to somehow aggregate a little bit the data.
That's great. Thank you, Naysan. I think it's super interesting to see how you adapt according to the municipality that you're working with, and you're always looking to find solutions. So I think that's super great, and it's a really concrete example that allows us to see how AI can be used and put to action. So thank you for that. I want to also turn to another very concrete application of AI, to Eleonore, actually. So some of your recent work was using parliamentary speeches from legislatures in the Northern Territories of Canada to better understand the quality of deliberative debate. So your work made use of natural language processing to gain insights from around 20 years worth of legislative debates, and drawing on data that was made available as a matter of course in parliamentary proceedings. So you were actually able to transform this qualitative data, so this text, into quantitative data, facilitating the possibility of processing huge amounts of unstructured data. I think this is absolutely amazing, and provides a lot of opportunity to think about what kind of unstructured data could we potentially use and gain insights from. So Eleonore, I was hoping we could get a better sense of this process, learn about what insights you're able to draw through your work, and also think about the risks that we need to keep in mind as we move from open data to AI.
Sure. So, and I'm actually really happy that you asked about the specific case, because I think it allows us to kind of talk about both open data for democracy and also open AI. So the project, just to give a little bit of context, the project that you're talking about was an analysis of about 250,000 parliamentary speeches from Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon to understand how parliamentarians over time, so in the last 20 years, have been deliberating and creating policies. And so we needed data for that. I wouldn't say based on your definition it was exactly open. So the Hansards, which are the transcript of parliamentary proceedings, they are publicly available, in all provinces and territories in Canada. But they were actually pretty difficult to extract. So they were in PDF formats, and definitely all in different formats, and formats that changed over time. So it took us a long time to write the scripts to process the data. But what I did, and this is something that I had actually started for my master's a while back, and then for my PhD. So it took it's something that I've been working on for about 10 years. But it's the development of a tool that would analyze this. And so the tool is called Delib Analysis, and it basically converted each speech into a set of quantitative features. So as you mentioned, it's using text analysis, so NLP techniques, and then it kind of breaks apart each person's text into ways, in different indicators that you could then use to feed into an algorithm. And then I used a classification algorithm which would predict certain elements in each speech. And so I used different indicators that are drawn from political theory. So for example, are speakers respectful of each other or not? Do they speak positionally? They only talk about their own position, or do they include other people's comments? Do they think about public interests? Are they engaged with each other? So all these kinds of really qualitative elements we were able to predict. So I actually With my team, we created 36 models. So we had these 12 indicators, and then we made one of each for each territory. And the point of this whole thing was to understand different parliamentary structures. So it's not really that well known, but Nunavut and Northwest Territories have consensus-based parliaments. And so the idea is to kind of look at how these parliaments are working, and to also present kind of a different way of organizing decision making. So this is kind of an example of something that without the data being accessible, it wouldn't have been possible. And then without the computational techniques that we have available to us now, it would have been really impossible for political scientists to analyze this kind of data by hand. So the tool is open source, and so any researchers can use it to analyze their own data. And the idea was to make it ultra explainable. So you mentioned that AI can be very difficult to explain depending on the algorithm. So what I did at the time is that I selected a pretty simple algorithm in terms of how far AI can go, which had a much easier capacity to state what indicators were in there, how they were weighted. It was just really clear, and it actually would output like this is a description of everything that goes into the model, so that when researchers were using, they could really understand what they were looking at. So it's used in a few universities. For example, the Open University of Catalonia uses this to analyze tweets related to the independence from Spain, for example. So there's been like different use cases. So I think, there's a few things in this example. One, I think it kind of shows to how powerful open data and open AI can be in the answering of societal questions and in kind of enhancing thought in democracy. But also, how we can create models that are open and that are shareable between universities and between companies and research groups, so that we can just kind of expand our capacities. So I think that there's advantages and disadvantages, but definitely I wanted to focus on some of the promises also of these kinds of technologies.
That's great. Thank you, Eleonore. I think it's also really interesting that you mentioned that, some of this data that you were using, actually a lot of it was available, but it wasn't necessarily open. It was in PDF format. So just really resonates with me working at open data. There's actually a lot of work that goes into just preparing the data, getting it in the right format. And, these things don't happen magically. So I think it's just nice to remember that there's a lot of work that goes into it. And although we think that the output just appears, there's all of those steps that have to happen prior. So thank you for that. And it's also a very, very concrete example of, as you said, just how powerful open data and AI can be together. So I think that's super great. And now I want to get into more of like the nitty gritty, and, the big elephant in the room is often talking about privacy. So I want to kind of take us back for a moment and, think about the early days of open data, where the mentality was often just build it and they will come, just open the data, just put it out there and let's see what happens with it. And today machine learning offers us really amazing analytical capacities, just as Eleonore said, like things that we probably weren't able to do before. And specifically, that the added bonus of AI is that we can make links between data sets that couldn't be made before. Now, this is great, but it's also raising concerns in publishing open data, because in a data set that we actually thought was really well anonymized, AI tools may actually be able to cross-reference data and then identify individuals, thereby breaching their privacy. I often think about an example I heard of regarding taxi data released by the city of New York. The city thought that the data they released protected privacy because it stripped it of identifiable information. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case, as the data was actually used to identify celebrities and their whereabouts. So overall, we find that AI is amplifying privacy concerns in publishing open data. So it might not be a question now of just throwing the data out there and seeing what happens. So Abhishek, in your work around AI ethics, I want to see how this resonated with you and what kind of safeguards, checks, and balances should we look to build into open data publishing so that we can mitigate these harmful outcomes around privacy breaches.
Yeah, no, that's and I guess I hate to be the bearer of bad news here. When we're talking about open data, yes, it has a lot of benefits, but also a lot of things that we got to be careful about, right? And an example of that is, of course, privacy breaches. So the New York taxi data set is a well-known common example. In fact, this dates back to more than 20 years ago now, where one of the first data sets that was released was by AOL. Not sure how many people remember what AOL was, but they released search data back in '99, and people were able to, using the search queries and search terms, they were able to pinpoint a specific person, an old woman who lived in the Midwest in the United States, down to figuring out, that she had a dog, what prescriptions she took, and that kind of stuff. Because let's face it, the search engine probably knows more about you than your significant other. So, if you're able to, de-anonymize a person from their search queries, that's pretty, potent, but also dangerous, right? And there are examples later on as well where people were able to take anonymized data from Netflix, combine that with publicly available data from IMDb, and they were able to reverse engineer a person's undisclosed sexual orientation, which led to repercussions in her workplace and family life. And then there was a more recent example with Strava, talking about basically they had released, so Strava is a fitness app, and they had released the heat maps of people exercising, and essentially what that ended up doing was it made public the location of undisclosed military databases, because as you can imagine, soldiers have pretty regimented ways of going about doing their exercises. So again, lots of problems when you put out data in the open. Of course, it can lead to fantastic applications, but there are concerns in terms of privacy as well. And one of the things that is at the heart of these kinds of de-anonymization efforts is what's called the mosaic effect. So the mosaic effect basically means you combine disparate sources of data to create a rich profile that leads to that undoing of that anonymization that you hoped would protect people's privacy. And this has been empowered by these shadow actors who are called data brokers. And for the longest time, FTC and other regulatory agencies have tried to rein them in, but they're just so pervasive, these data brokers, that they collate all these data sets, basically equipping people to leverage the mosaic effect to break anonymization. And it's not just this. One of the things that came up as we were talking about this in the past few minutes was the more advanced techniques we start to use, the more powerful our ability to leverage the mosaic effect. And as Eleonore was saying, some of these large-scale models that are trained on publicly available data, not all of this publicly available data was meant to be in the public domain in the first place. So what we've seen, some researchers, specifically Carlini's lab at U of T, what they've shown is that GPT-2, which precursor to the more popularly known GPT-3 at the moment, GPT-2, as it scales in size, actually has a very strong memorization effect, and it's able to reproduce, low frequency, sample points in its training data, which sometimes ends up being phone numbers and addresses, things that existed on contracts between people. And so again, huge privacy breaches, even for people who didn't even know that their data was online and being scraped to create these models in the first place. All that is gloomy and doomy. What can we do to perhaps protect ourselves? there are two very promising avenues that you can leverage. One being differential privacy, which is sort of the gold standard if you're trying to put out open data and hope to maintain privacy protections. Essentially, what differential privacy does compared to all other techniques of privacy preservation is that it is future-proof against side channel attacks and auxiliary information attacks, meaning that even if I obtain extra information later on, I can't use that to combine it with the data that you've released to de-anonymize. And it obviously comes with trade-offs, and I'm happy to answer questions on that later on without going into too many details now. But that's one promising technique that can make us put out open data but still be cognizant of privacy protections. The other being federated learning, which relies on training on device. So your data never leaves your device, and training sort of happens there. And it's only the updates to the model weights that are sent back to a central repository. So helping to maintain a little bit your privacy. Again, this comes with trade-offs. Happy to explore that in the question section as well. But these are two promising techniques that can help. Yeah.
Thank you, Abhishek. So I think those, it's great to have some concrete, as we say in French, pistes de solution. So I also want to thinking about, what open data publishers should keep in mind as AI continues to really alter the technology landscape. As already said, Naysan, your work is so inspiring to me because it shows how open data can contribute to AI applications that are used to actually improve decision making and ultimately provide better services to citizens. So do you have any ideas based on your experience collaborating with open data publishers on what public administrations can do to potentially multiply these cases, these positive outcomes, and ultimately favor uses of open data and AI in a way that's responsible and also responsive to the needs of communities?
Thank you so much for for the question, because I have a lot of suggestions based on our experience trying to aggregate data from multiple municipalities. Just as Eleonore and Abhishek mentioned, you end up having a lot of different formats. And so what usually happens is that every city is going to, assign a few people to deal with their open data. The smallest the city is, of course, you're going to have a smaller team. And as you mentioned yourself, it's work just to make sure that the data is kept up to date on the webpage of the municipality. But there is another thing that I think open data providers don't necessarily think about that is actually very important on our end. So it's the fact that we're going to have to deal with all these different formats. So I'm just going to give you an example. For our solution that's called IntelliPipes on the water main breaks, municipalities, more and more municipalities across Canada and the US, they're publishing open data of their water network. So this can have privacy issues, specifically for municipalities that are, I would say, that are worried that this could actually be used for terrorism. They don't want to publish where their water sources are, which is actually understandable. But let's say, long story short, you're going to have a bunch of CSV or a shapefile, and you're going to have, let's say, the identification of the water main, you're going to have the diameter, you're going to have the age. But so it seems easy to create a file that contains the water network, but you would be surprised how much work it actually took our team to create something similar to what Eleonore did with the PDF files that she had, though I think it was more complicated. But what we did was basically trying to understand, okay, you have this format. Some cities are using inches. Other cities are using centimeters. Some cities are using this code for this particular material. Other cities are using a different code. And all of this is creating work on the side of the people who are actually doing the data science. And if it's a company like us, I mean, it's okay because we're a company. At some point, we're going to take that work into consideration in our pricing. So unfortunately, it's going to be a more expensive product just because we had to do all of the work. But let's say you have all of these NGOs that are actually working to create all of these open products for the public, but they also have that work, and that's people that are actually doing this on their free time. So I think one thing that would be very interesting that we actually started thinking of was trying to talk to all of these different open data providers and to think about a common standard that we could all agree on. Okay, this is the standard, the open data standard for us is, let's say, water mains, but it could be different. It could be, I don't know if we could do something like this for parliamentary speeches. I don't know. That's Eleanor's to tell. But basically, this standard could itself be open. So open to suggestions and also open, let's say, on GitLab or something, so that people could actually contribute to the standard. And whenever an organization is trying to open their data set, they know that there is a particular standard that if they follow, it's going to be better for them eventually, because everybody who is going to aggregate those data sets, they're going to have just a simpler program just to aggregate everything instead of spending so much time trying to do case by case. So yeah.
I think that's really, really great, Naysan. And I'm also hearing a lot that there's, work to be done around interoperability, standards. Is there also, how does metadata play into this? So data that actually describes the data sets, is that something that you're thinking about as well?
Yeah, that's something else. So I'm just going to give you an example. I'm not going to name the municipality, but let's say there was a municipality that had their open data portal that was saying, okay, this is our water main data, and you can download it. You can, do AI, and you can send us the product, and let's talk. And then we downloaded the data and we're ready to use it. And then we just realized that it was completely unusable because you had some columns, you actually didn't know what the columns meant. So at some point we decided, okay, let's send a request for information to the open data group of the municipality. And of course, I think you know what I'm talking about. These people are very busy. So it can take weeks before they actually process your data, your request for information, and it can even take months before they actually act on it. So this really depends on, I think, how many resources, how much time and money the city can dedicate to their open data team. But I was actually talking to the former open data manager of the city of New York, and they actually voted a law that made it, they had a maximum of 2 weeks. So if somebody sends a request for information or an inquiry, they have 2 weeks tops to respond. And it could be an answer, okay, we're going to get back to your processing, but actually just for the other person to know that, okay, things are, somebody is there responding. Somebody is actually going to take care of this at some point. So for that particular city, unfortunately, we were lacking metadata. That was crucial. And we didn't it got lost. We got a couple of backs and forths, but after 3 emails, I think 6 months has passed, so we just gave up on that one. So I do think, so metadata, probably having a deadline for just letting the person know that the request was received, and also having a standard, yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think it's super important to remember that there is that service to citizens that come with open data, and it's great to ask questions. It's great to ask for more data. Like there always there can always be more questions asked, and we need to be able to get back to citizens and really accompany them through the process of using the data so that it can actually become information and insights and decision making down the line. So now I kind of want to shift gears a bit slightly and talk a bit about inclusion and impacts of AI on different groups. Eleonore, in your experience as the director of the Inclusive Technology Lab, looking beyond just open data, why do we need to pay particular attention to the way that data systems and technologies are designed?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And so I'm, in addition to uses of AI for kind of democracy studies, I'm really interested in the impact of different AI technologies on what I would call the most vulnerable populations. And a good example of that is the use of AI technologies in a humanitarian context. So I worked quite a bit in my career in international organizations, and there's growing kind of climate and economic and pandemic crises. So the number of migrants and refugees globally is really increasing over time, and so international community is always looking for ways in which to innovate, to use potentially new technologies in order to help fulfill their mission. So AI is used, for example, to make forecasts, to collect all kinds of data, and to understand, when crises are going to happen, have a bit of what they call anticipatory action. So predict when crises are going to happen, how many migrants are going to come and to a certain area, and what are they going to need in terms of aid. So they do a lot of that kind of work, and then also use AI technologies like biometric identification to provide basic goods, or even to track claims like refugee claims or visas. So there's all kinds of uses, and there's just so many different layers. But I think that ultimately, often when these technologies are used, they're extremely promising, but the most vulnerable groups are usually not taken into account. And in particular with migrants and refugees, they're not really in a position to advocate for themselves. And so they really are often kind of the audience or the user of technologies that, if they don't agree with the way it's used, or if they have, they don't agree with the output of a prediction or something like that, they really. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, you
I think I
just cut out for like 10 seconds. So.
Yeah. Okay. So what interested me a lot is to look at policy solutions. So Abhishek mentioned some kind of technology solutions, and there's also a lot of ethical guidelines that are currently being developed all around the world in different sectors. But now we're also starting to do policies. So the big one is the European Commission in April came up with a proposal for a regulation of AI. And it kind of categorizes AI into three groups: low risk, high risk, and completely forbidden. And then this morning, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, kind of echoed these sentiments that we should think about, the risk of AI and kind of treat different technologies depending on their risk to individuals or to populations. And what's interesting in this regulation is that the high risk group lists a lot of uses of AI that are really applicable to vulnerable populations. For example, they specifically mention, border control. They mention labor kind of HR type algorithms. They mention biometric surveillance. So they mention all kinds of AI that really affect vulnerable populations. And the proposal would be that every time an AI technology is developed for those uses, it would have to be certified. And the certification process would be really a lot like a drug, like a pharmaceutical drug, in which you would have to produce a lot of proof of examination of, what could be the adverse effects on different populations. And I didn't quite explain, what those risks could be. So in addition to, lacking the possibility of appealing decisions. There's just kind of the impact of error. So there's a lot of errors that have been documented. Abhishek mentioned some of them. There's a lot of issues with facial recognition systems, for example, that have a high rate of error for women of color, for example, much higher than other populations. Those are obviously have a strong impact in refugee populations, and we've seen a lot of cases in which a refugee claim is denied because of an error in a facial recognition algorithm. So when there's an error or when there's a bias in a system, the impact is just so great when you're dealing with populations that are highly vulnerable. So that's what I think the regulation is coming. So I like to talk about the EU regulation because it's kind of new, but it's really possible that it's going to have an impact on the way in which we do AI in Canada, in the US, and even globally. So it's kind of like the first regulation, just like GDPR was for data. And I think it'll have a really big impact on AI ethics in the future.
Thank you, Eleonore. Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm definitely curious to see how this EU regulation is implemented, because it's one thing to have these different categories, but how does it actually come into practice? I think that's to be determined, right? And I want to keep diving into a bit more of these like power dynamics and actually think about how AI in some ways is contesting some of the values of the open data movement. Coming from open data myself, like the open data community often sees open data as a way of leveling the playing field, of giving everyone access to data and therefore just increasing opportunities for everyone. But when AI comes into the scene, it can kind of disrupt this image of open data being this great equalizers, because it's typically firms that have very significant resources at their disposal that can actually develop and leverage AI. And then these players kind of have the added benefit of using open data available to them to train their models. So I was just wondering, Abhishek, what do you think of this idea of these like contesting values between AI and open data? And also, how can we kind of maybe think about rebalancing the equation so that AI can be used to unlock kind of the value of open data while also making these models more transparent?
Right. So I think you already sort of alluded to, what I will say, which is that it's not just open data that's important, or that would help to balance the equation, because I think the current trend, and I don't agree with this trend in the sense that I think it where it's going, it's just exacerbating inequities in society. But the current trend is that we're inching towards larger and larger and more sophisticated models, and these have significant environmental impacts, which is actually something that we're assessing. I chair the standards group at the Green Software Foundation, where we're analyzing this and proposing ways to reduce that. But to answer your question, I think even when we're talking about open data, and obviously Naysan gave quite a few very interesting examples, as did Eleonore, where just having open data isn't enough. It needs to be high quality open data that's amenable to machine learning in the first place. You have many different sets of principles, fair data, care data, that talk about how to have good quality, high quality open data sets that actually are amenable to machine learning. Specifically, curating and creating that takes a lot of investment, right? But I think the biggest differentiator today for those who are successful with AI and those who aren't is the ability to productionize ML models, right? And what I mean by that is actually, doing your modeling, doing all of that stuff, and then actually moving it into a production environment where you're able to, serve it up as a part of a product or service. And without that, you really don't have much, right? So having, being able to do that in a reliable and robust manner is very important. Now, how do we get there, right? I think as we're talking about some of these very, very large scale models, first and foremost, I think we need to democratize access to compute infrastructure, right? even though cloud computing has made access to large-scale computing better than it was before, it's still out of reach for a lot of people who don't have the financial resources to be able to lease compute infrastructure. So, one of the suggestions that's been gaining a lot of traction in the United States is having a national public cloud that would make such compute infrastructure accessible to academics, startups, small organizations who don't necessarily have the funds of large corporations, or well-funded, academic labs. The other thing, which relates to the point that I was talking about in terms of the key differentiator, which is the ability to productionize these systems. And I think that's still quite specialized knowledge which resides within large organizations, which I think we need to have better education when we're talking about AI, which for the time being, I think still focuses quite a bit on the theoretical aspects, or the side of things where we're not really talking about production grade systems that serve millions of customers. And that sort of knowledge is what needs to be democratized if we are to leverage AI truly to capitalize on open data. So ultimately, I think most of the state of the art stuff when it comes to the algorithmic advances is already available open source. Some of the common data sets are also available open source with the caveats that I mentioned. But it's really the specialized knowledge that's missing at the moment, for which we need better educational programs, and of course access to public clouds or things that make compute infrastructure more financially accessible to people who don't have the resources. And just to sort of wrap that up, there are initiatives that are community driven, grassroots driven, that are doing this, especially in the NLP domain. I would encourage folks to check out work that some of my friends are doing at Eleuther AI, the Big Science Project from Hugging Face, and the Masakane group out of Africa that are doing multi-language NLP for low-resource languages as well.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. I'll definitely be looking up those resources afterwards. So we're getting close towards the end.
Yes,
So
sorry.
I just wanted to give everyone like a last round. What's your main takeaway from this panel? If you had to give participants today something to bite their teeth on, walking away from the Canadian Open Data Summit around AI, what would it be? Naysan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree 100% with Abhishek. For Canadian and North American startups, but I actually think for a lot of our startups as well around the world, the one thing that's really nice is that IBM, Google, Microsoft, basically all of the Amazon as well, basically all of the big providers, they actually do provide at least 1 year of free computing resources, up to $100,000 of cloud, which is a lot by many standards. But you need to be part of a startup incubator. So this is the part that's not working yet. So this maybe would be the next step. Not necessarily, you don't need to be part of an incubator. If you do have an idea, you can get something. I also think there is Compute Canada. So I think we do have a couple of interesting options, even for small companies in Canada, at least. Yeah, so just wanted to say that maybe another maybe request, I think, for municipalities for the quality of the data. That's really important to the people who are going to use it. And yeah, I think open data has really the potential, and specifically with AI, with the fact that there is a lot of effort and will to democratize this next step of our humanity's technological progress, to make it accessible to everybody. So yeah, I think eventually we're going to get there, but it's just small steps that we'll have to take.
Thank you, Naysan. Eleonore, what are your takeaways?
Well, first of all, I really like your comments, Miranda and Abhishek, about the tensions between open data principles and the kind of AI ethics. I thought that was a really interesting way to frame it. And I kind of feel like AI ethic now encompasses open data is like a small part of this big beast that is AI ethics. That's kind of the way it's like swallowed it in a way. And I think that it's just because it's such a powerful technology and it just touches so many different parts of our lives in a way that, you know, the open data movement was really focused on governance, on accountability and transparency in government. And AI is actually so much bigger than that. I like the idea of data as a public good and kind of the thoughts about decentralization of AI. I think that's going to be something that's just critical, because the more we develop these technologies, if we don't have that, inequalities are we're already in kind of an increasingly unequal world. It's just going to increase even more. And so thinking about possibilities that kind of redistribute these capacities, these technological capacities globally, I think is super important. And I also wanted to agree with what you said, Naysan, about the importance of metadata and standards. There's a standard that's used for humanitarian data called IATI. That is, you know, it's used a lot. It's good and bad, but it's really used in order to share humanitarian data across different countries. So I thought maybe you might be interested in looking into that. But you know, overall, I think it's actually a very exciting time to be in AI. Yeah, you're welcome. And I mean, it's interesting because change is coming and it's coming quickly. There's a lot of energy in the ethics components, you know, cool technologies like what Naysan is talking about, and now policy. So I think that we're both flooded with just so much innovation, but it's also like trying to make sense of that, and it's happening right now. So it's definitely a great time to be thinking about these issues. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone about it.
Thank you so much, Eleonore. Abhishek, closing thoughts for us.
Yeah, I think, this will sound bizarre coming from someone who does machine learning for a living and gets paid to do it. But really ask if AI is needed. I think that's my big takeaway for folks is a lot of the times you can just use something simpler that's actually more explainable, more powerful, gets you to a product faster if you're building a startup. So don't jump at, it's that, or not all that glitters is gold, right? That old adage. That's basically what AI is. It's this glittering piece of gold that everybody gets excited about, but it's actually incredibly difficult to get it right in practice. So start with simple stuff and ask whether AI is really needed. And really, I think, a broader comment that I would make is that nothing about our world is given, right? What I mean by that is that I think we should all ask critical questions of the solutions that surround us, of the products and services that surround us, and see whether they're really serving us or are we serving it or them. So that's, just keep a critical eye open and question everything.
I'm keeping my eyes open, Abhishek, so thank you. Now we do have a few minutes left. I think we'll have time to answer some questions. So questions I've been seeing come in from the audience, so that's great. Also I saw another comment actually for Eleonore. Someone was interested in having the link to your research. So if you have time to put that in the chat, or I can find it afterwards and link that. Someone doing their master's research. So that could be really useful for them. And we also have
I'll
Schallum.
put a link to the GitHub.
Perfect, thank you. Schallum is back with us too, so to take questions all together, so that's really great. Okay, so the first question, I'll read it out in French and then kind of do my rough translation in English so everyone can understand. So it says, étant donné que les fondements de l'intelligence artificielle...
Given that artificial intelligence is based on data, do you think that a population group could influence open data and also influence people by using that artificial intelligence for their own advantage? My question is mostly about the context of unsupervised machine learning.
Are based on data. Do you see a danger that a group of the population can influence open data and therefore influence algorithms to their advantage and not to the advantage of the entire population. My question deals with mainly cases around non-supervised machine learning. Is there anyone who wants to dig into that one? Yeah, Schallum, I see him nodding. Oh, putting him on the spot maybe? I don't hear you though. Schallum, do you want to take this one? On t'entend pas.
Non?
We can't hear you.
Okay,
No? Okay. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, so the question is very relevant given the title of our panel today. We're talking about transparency, and this is why we understand the importance of transparency, of accountability. So Bill 64 is interesting because there are some requirements related to companies, for example. So companies would need to have a person who is responsible for that file. So we would need to have a specific person responsible for the decision making. So we need to understand the methods used, and we need to better understand, and it would help us to understand if there's a problem eventually.
I can add to that, ou je vais continuer en français.
I'm going to continue in French. What's interesting for this question is that we need to think. So for open data, is it possible to influence artificial intelligence by injecting data? That's a problem of misinformation, and it's also a cybersecurity problem. So we need to build some secure models. We need to make sure that no one can have access to the data input and change the data that's been entered so that they can change the model. So these are all techniques that we need to consider when we are creating our models. There's also another element, you've mentioned it. We need to think when we are creating the models. We need to understand what kind of biases may exist. And often when we work on data like Abhishek does, there can be pressure. Some developers will ask us to work very quickly and to find models very quickly. And there is a mentality where people want to break things quickly. But today, with our ethical considerations, we find that we need to slow down. We need to slow our pace to make sure that everything is done properly. And this helps us to protect our data sets. For example, if there's data that has bad intentions or that's a bad quality, then we can exclude it.
Very quickly, I really want to get this last question in, so I'm going to go for it. Sometimes AI can appear as some kind of black box to the general public. Do you think we need explainable AI? And if so, how do we make it a reality, knowing that there are still disparities in who can access and understand open data and technology? Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui peut prendre cette question-là? Ou je peux bien répondre?
Would anyone like to answer that question, or I can also repeat in French?
I just want to add a quick piece of information to this particular question. It's that the more complicated the model gets, the bigger it gets, the more parameters and the more data, the better its performance is going to be usually, but the less explainable it's going to be. So it's really a trade-off right now. We did a lot of work with many customers, try to get explainability into the very complex model is very difficult, just because of all of the parameters and what's inside the model. At some point, even the data scientist doesn't understand. So I really want to do this quickly, so maybe the other hosts can answer the question. But on our end, actually, it's been very difficult. So if you really want explainability, we have to scale down to something that's more statistical, simpler, and then it can show you what's going on.
Thank you, Naysan. Any final comments? on that one?
Well, I would add on that very quickly that there's a field of research now which is called explainable AI. And I think people are really putting a lot of thought into how to make complicated AI systems more explainable. So I would definitely, the comment about the black box is sometimes approached as kind of a finality and like, there's nothing we can do about it. And I don't agree. You know, I think that like we can't accept this. We're going to need to figure it out, especially in cases like high risk uses where, you know, in the European Commission example, they're asking specifically for explainable AI in these cases, and you need to really document what you're doing. So I think we're not going to have a choice. And so I would say that it may change. Like we may start having, and we're starting to have tools in explainable AI, and we'll start having more ways in which to communicate complex deep learning algorithms. And so I'm feeling kind of optimistic about that changing in the future because a lot of people are complaining.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for this panel. I'm sure we could talk for another couple of hours on this. Je vous remercie énormément.
I thank you so much for this very enlightening discussion.